Thank you, Jenny, and welcome everyone to this month's webinar. During this webinar, you will be able to ask any questions to our panelists via the Q&A area of the WebEx event. And this recording and the Q&A will be published a week from today's live broadcast. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bob Poulos to take us through the Remedy AR system licensing overview. Bob?
Thank you, Greg. Welcome, everyone. And my name is Bob Poulos. I am a lead product developer on the AR system server team, a longtime member of that server team, and I'm very pleased to be here today to present this Remedy AR system licensing overview. The topics that we are going to cover today, we're going to talk about essentially the basics of what licensing is about, look at how licenses are assigned, what types there are, how they're released. We're also going to view the various ways that one can view the license usage. And then we're going to dive into a little bit more about how the server group manages the license usage. And also I'll give a live demonstration of just some simple license granting and releasing, and look at the ways that, again, that we've covered in the presentation about how you view that license usage. And then we'll cover some of the references that are available on the BMC docs for licensing, and then transition into a Q&A session. Okay, so let's dive in and start with an overview of what licensing is. And really, it grants the legal right to use the AR system and BMC provided applications. And there's 3 levels that licenses are required at: the server level, the application level, and then at user levels. At the application level specifically, the homegrown applications do not require application level licenses. Only BMC provided applications do. But even the homegrown applications do require an AR platform license to operate. And then the license key is required only on a server license. In the years past, license keys were required on all licenses, but there was a change a few years ago that where they were required only on a server license now. And other license types can be added without a key, provided you have a server license on the machine. And then those all have configurable limits that are designed to match whatever you are contracted to have. But by not requiring a license key on those other license types, it does allow for emergency limit changes without contacting BMC. And so there's no delay in anything that you need to do in terms of changing what your license limits are. And then any usage that occurs over the contracted amount, it's reconciled afterwards. And then it's just important to note that in unlicensed server, it does run, but it will run with limited capabilities. And that's especially important that it runs because the only way to add a official license keys server license is to add it into a running system. So you have to start the system first in an unlicensed manner and then add the license key. Okay, so let's talk about some of the license categories. There is, at the highest level, we've got the AR server license, and this is, again, the one that requires the license key for each server instance. And then there's the application license, which is the overall application license that allows a BMC application to run on the system. There's a level of AR user license, which is the platform level, and it establishes the capabilities that each user has on the system. There's an AR user application license. So this is at the same level as the platform license, but it's specific to an application, and it establishes what access a user has to BMC applications. And there's also somewhat recent development, this concept of a bundled license, where it's a package of licenses and it's identified by a role. For example, you might have like a Remedy service desk user role that the bundle is available to purchase, where whatever the set of application user licenses that are needed to perform that role and the AR user platform license needed for that role, and it's all in one package. And this was an added feature because as they were being sold this way, it was difficult to translate that into what type of licenses needed to be added to the system. So now they can be added as a bundle to the system, and then under the covers, the server knows, well, what is in this bundle, what does it mean to have a bundle, which application licenses are in it. And so it's a lot easier to administer using this bundled license feature. Okay, let's talk about the AR system user license types. There's 4 types. The top 2 you see listed here, the fixed and the floating, are the ones that are purchased. So those are the write licenses. The bottom 2, the read and restricted read, are the ones that they're not a purchasable license. They're available to just apply. And so fixed license is one where it's specifically assigned to a user and it's reserved for them. So they will always be able to write on the system when you're a fixed license user. A floating license is a shared pool license, so you're sharing it with other users, and it's dynamically granted when a user performs a license requiring operation. And that's always provided when it's available because it is a shared pool. So if there are other users that have used up all the floating licenses, you might not get one on a temporary basis. The read license designation allows the user to create, search, and display entries within the permissions they've been assigned. And the modification of entries submitted by that user is possible if a given configuration is on the server, and that configuration is called submitter mode locked. And you can look that up in the remedy documentation to get more information about what that means. And it should be noted that floating license users, they can temporarily have this read license status if they cannot get a write license or their license has timed out because they've been inactive for a certain period of time. And then lastly, there is a restricted read license type where a user can create, search, and display entries, again, within the permissions they've been assigned, but modify is not allowed for this type of user. And the users with this license type are allowed to log in from multiple locations simultaneously, whereas other license type users are not allowed to log in from multiple locations. Okay, so when are the right licenses assigned? So these licenses are assigned when a query to retrieve data or a write operation is performed for the first time. And licenses are assigned on a query under the assumption that the intent is to perform some sort of update after that query. And by doing this, it prevents any panic scenarios where someone has done extensive updates, you've been typing 20 minutes of text in on a ticket, and then you find out that when you go to save it, you can't save it because there's no write license available. In this scenario, now you've got one on the query, you've already got your write license, so you're safe to go ahead and do that submission. And the exceptions to this list, to this write license assignment there's a few forms where a write license is not required, and for example, the AR system user preference form. And then queries that even though they do get a floating write license, they don't require it to successfully return the data. So if there is a situation where no floating write license is available, the query will still work and return data. And then their application write licenses, those are assigned when the designated application forms are accessed. So the system knows which forms belong to what application and what license is required to access them. So when are these licenses released? So they're held until one of two things occurs. The user explicitly logs off from all their current sessions, and this includes shutting down the browser used for a mid-tier session. And that's because the mid-tier recognizes that the browser has been shut down and does a log off on behalf of the user. And then also when the user is inactive on the server for the configured license timeout period. And that timeout period defaults to 2 hours, and it can be set to as low as 1 hour. So when a user hasn't used the system at all during that period, their license will be returned, be released and returned to the pool of available licenses. And so all the BMC GUI clients have a contract to maintain the user's license, unless one of those two things occurs. And there's inside these clients, the session management must maintain at least one user session. So they have, there's different models, session models that are used. Those of you that remember the old Remedy user tool, it used a multi-session model where it always had a parent session for any user. And then anytime a user did a query, it started a child session and then released that at the end of the query. And that was developed to when there was a cancel query feature added to the tool. And so it went into a multi-session mode in that. But the key was that it always keeps the parent session. And by keeping that parent session, you're keeping this quote-unquote contract. And the same is true for other clients as well. And the mid-tier session timeout is independent of license releasing. So there's a configurable session timeout on the mid-tier, and it's only concerned with the mid-tier session. It is not the same as the server session. So when you time out on the mid-tier, it doesn't mean your license is going to be released. Historically, there's been some times when the mid-tier didn't conform with this, and that's all been fixed in later releases. And then the server group licenses, they can, across a server group, a license can be released on a specific server. But it's at the same time, it might still be held on another server because there's a different session on that other server. So it's not always true that when a user is released on one server, that they're going to be released on all the servers in a server group. And when someone is released on a server, there is a notification that it's session specific that goes to the other servers. So the server will clean up a given session across all servers. But again, it doesn't mean necessarily that that user will be released everywhere if they have other sessions. And that's the expected behavior. Let's talk a little bit about license pools, because this is a feature for floating licenses where they can be reserved per group. So on the group form, there's a couple of fields. One is for designating how many floating licenses should be reserved for the group, and then for the different application floating licenses, how many are reserved. And so by reserving them, you're saying these are exclusively available for users that are members of that group. And any licenses that aren't reserved for specific groups are classified as the unreserved licenses, and you'll see that terminology used in the user logging, for example. So, and if this license pooling feature is not used at all, then essentially all your floating licenses are classified as unreserved. And then if there's a oversubscription of available licenses, meaning like there's only 10 floating licenses available on the system, but the group form someone is allocated 15, that oversubscription will be noted in the error log and the user log, and the server will assign what licenses it can to any given groups, and then what other groups won't get any that they've been designated to have. Okay, so let's talk about license usage. We'll cover the top level here, and then I'll dive into each one of these specifically. There's essentially 5 ways to look at license usage. One is the old admin console, where you can view the usage on the server that the console is connected to. So this is a server-centric view, not the server group as a whole. There's the relatively new server group console, which gives you a view of license usage across the server group. So it's a consolidated view. There is the license tracking feature, which is a form-based license transaction tracking that works across the server group. And this is an optional feature. There is the old user logging that's been there forever, which details the license transactions with the current usage counts. And the user logging is specific to each server, but it does have some server group information in it. And then there's the license report.txt, which is the repository that's managed by the server. And in it are snapshots of the license allocations and license usage that is used for auditing of license purposes. Okay, let's look at each one of these. So the admin console is the interface that lists the usage count on the current system. So across this user, the users listed here may also be on other systems. There may be other users that aren't listed here that are connected to other systems. So, but this is going to give you the view of how many users are connected to this system and what their current license type is. Also gives you the information of when their license was granted and the last time they accessed the system. So this is the server's internal view of what users are connected to it. The server group console is very similar, except it has a column over here on the right that the admin console does not, and that is called server list, and that's going to tell you which servers, it will list all of them that a given user is connected to. And then again, this is the consolidated view, so you'll see all the servers in a server group represented here and the users that are connected to all of them. And if users connected to multiple ones, there'll be one line here, but the server list will list multiple servers. Okay. All right, so let's look at the next item is license tracking. So this capability has two forms in it, and it's an optional capability, so you have to select it on the admin console to turn it on, and you can either turn on, did you want write licenses tracked or all license types. By default, it is disabled, so you'll need to turn it on if you'd like to use it. And then the first of the two forms is the AR system current license usage, and that has a set of entries in it for each user that's currently using a license. And that set is one main record per user and one sub-record per server that the user is accessing. So if they're currently connected to two servers, there would be 3 records in here, one main and 2 sub-records. The historical license usage form, it contains an entry for each completed license usage period. So once someone logs off and gets their license released, then an entry is put in here that details when they started using the license, when they finished using, and how many seconds they were on the system using the license. And as of version 1805, a new concept was added to this form where open-ended entries are put in for current usage as well. So prior to version 1805, it just had the pure historical data where if a user had to release their license before an entry got put into the historical form. But starting in version 1805, there's also the concept of when a user starts to use a license, an open-ended entry gets put into the historical form without the release time, and then that is updated later when they actually do release it. But the reason that was done is to facilitate reporting for what was the license usage at any one point in time. So for example, say it's 1 p.m. and I would like to know, well, back at 11 a.m., how many users were using floating licenses on the system. So prior to version 1805, I could get the historical data. Anybody who had been on at 11 a.m. but has already logged off, that information would be in this historical form. But I'd also have to couple that with the current license usage form data in my report to get a picture of everybody that was on at 11 and is now off the system not using a license, plus those people that were on at 11 and are still on using a license. So by having this open-ended entry in here, I can now do a report to find out the usage at any one point in time for both the users that have been released and those that are still on the system. And then it just should be noted that this tracking does add a small amount of overhead to the system. So when it is turned on, there's going to be more database activity than there was before. And the impact will grow if you are in a system where there's a lot of logging in and logging out and license assignment and release. The more of that activity that occurs, the more impact there's going to be. Okay, so the old trusty user log is another way to view license usage, and it's going to detail all the license transactions that occur, plus the logins and logouts. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this this guy here, and I'm going to get a pointer to help me show you what I'm talking about here. So I'd like to go through each one of these highlighted lines just to call them out and help with the understanding of what it means. So as you see, there's a login that does occur. There's a lot of logins and logouts, and so each one of those are recorded. And a relatively recent addition to the log file was this idea of a session ID, because as clients got more sophisticated, they began to use multiple sessions per user. And so it was sometimes unclear, well, what session was coming in and which one was going out. So the session ID now helps in the tracking of what the client is doing with its sessions. And then there'll be lines like this fixed grant right, which says at this point this user was assigned a fixed license, my demo admin user. There's also information like this when someone logs out, the session ID that was provided. And there's two pieces of information here. One is when someone logs out, it details, well, how many remaining sessions there are. So if there are remaining sessions, then licenses aren't released in terms of the floating license. So this count will explain why a license is not released if you're expecting it to be. And then another piece of information here is where the session ID came from. And this message here will say either local provided session ID, or it may say remote provided session ID. And the distinction between those two is the local provided session ID means a call came into this server specifically and said this session is being terminated. And if this had been a server group where a session is terminated on a given server, that server has the responsibility to notify other servers of this termination. If the other servers receive a message that says this is a remote termination message, it will log that this is a remote provided session ID. So that's the distinction. If you see both local and remote listed in your user log, that's why, that's what the difference is. And then when licenses are released, there's also a note in here about when one is released. And in this particular thing, the fixed release and the following logout are the two messages that are coupled together. And the fixed release occurred because the remaining session count went down to 0. Okay, there's also, you'll see things in here like this mid-tier service call. This is just indicative of the mid-tier service making an API call, logging in on its own behalf, not on behalf of a specific user. So when it makes calls because of a specific user, it'll have the username. When it's making a call for its own internal service needs, then it's called the mid-tier service. There, you'll also see floating licenses listed in here when they are granted, for example, and a listing of how many there are available and how many are used when this one was granted. So in this case, the first of the 2 write licenses that are available was granted to this user. Okay, let's see, there's also the concept of a server group database count. So when this line appears in the log, it's indicative of the server making a query to the database to find out how many floating license users there are. And in a couple of slides from now, we're going to talk about what the server does in a server group in regards to the accounting of licenses. So this floating no write free is logged when a user cannot get a write license, and in this case, all 2 write licenses were already used, so this user could not get one. So that's when you see the no write free, this is the indication of that. And it may be that if you've got licensed pools used, a user can't get a license even though there's some licenses still available to pools. They might not qualify for a license in that pool because they're not a member of the proper group to get one. So that's why this terminology says in use or reserved. So again, they might not all be in use, but this user doesn't have access to some of them because of the license pooling. You'll also see lines in here like this flush session. There's licenses and sessions can be flushed when they've reached their timeout period. So this indicates that a cleanup has occurred, that a user's been inactive for a given amount of time, and that's recorded in here as well. When licenses are released, for example, this floating release will be logged, and it will say that it's for a user right license or an application license. And I should have mentioned this earlier. The things we're going to go through here are in this presentation are mostly centric to the AR platform licenses, because the application license management in the AR system is the same as it is. The accounting is the same for application licenses and the AR user right licenses. So in terms of this presentation, I'm just focusing on the user licenses. If application licenses were involved here, they would be, the name of the license would be listed in this log file as well. And then I've highlighted this other line here in a different color, just to point out that it actually is not an accurate reading when a license is released, and this should not be in the log file, and it's going to be removed in a future release, because when a license is released on a given server, there's no guarantee that it's going to be released on all servers, because again, there may be, the user might have other sessions on those other servers. So at the time of the release, in this log file on this server, there shouldn't be any quote about how many licenses are used, because this server doesn't really know. It may have sent messages to the other servers to clean up. That license may be released, it may not be released, depending on the circumstances. So it's not proper to actually quote any license count on a release, and so this should be removed to avoid any confusion. Okay, and then there's, again, at the bottom here, there's a concept of a floating right upgrade. So since a floating license was released, there was now one available the next time this non-admin 3 user came into the system and tried to get a license. There was one available this time. Previously, they couldn't get one. So they went into a read mode, and then when they did get one finally, they were quote-unquote upgraded to a write license, and then that's indicated here in the log file. Okay, so that's a walkthrough of what you see in the user log. Lots of information, lots of transaction tracking in the world of logins, logouts, license assignment, license releasing. Okay, and then the last area that is considered a view into the license usage world is this license report.txt file, and it's a server managed file where the server will periodically write a snapshot of the license configuration and current usage counts, and it's into a text file. And this serves as the source data for the license audit report that gets presented to BMC. So, and this was previously and currently is just a file out on the disk, but as of version 8.05, the server writes a backup copy of this file into the database. So that helps in case files get deleted by accident. If this file was to get deleted, there's a backup copy in the database now. Okay, so as I said before, we're going to talk a little bit about these accounting that occurs in the server group for licenses. And the backbone of this accounting is there's a set of data dictionary tables, one for user licenses and one for app licenses. They're called serve group userlic and serve group applik. And these tables in the database will record record gets added to them that will identify a user has a floating license and on what server. So when a user accesses multiple servers in the group, for example, in a load balanced environment, they may end up sending calls to any 3, 4, or 5 servers. A record is going to be added for each one of those combinations. So each user will use a so each user, when a user accesses, when they remove a license from a server, there's going to get a record deleted from the appropriate table. So when a user is released from the server that receives the API call, I had mentioned before that it's going to notify the other servers in the group in case that user has accessed those servers with that same session identifier. So a license is considered no longer in use by a user when they've been removed from all systems in the group. And the server will use this table to get a count of in-use floating licenses by just simply querying the table for unique users. So it doesn't matter whether they're connected to 1 or 3 servers. When the server does the query, it's just going to find out how many unique users are in the system using a floating license. And it does that by just getting a database count. And the server does try to limit the frequency of this query. It doesn't want to continually make it every time the user does an operation or somebody logs in. But it will always issue this query when the belief is there are no licenses available, because it does want to get the very latest count in that situation so that it can make the proper decision about whether there truly are no licenses available. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the little demonstration that I have. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll take a look at a couple of clients here. So I've decided to set up a couple of API test drivers because they are the simplest clients of all. Let's see. Yeah. And this will allow a very simple session model. So when you log in with a test driver, there's no multiple sessions. It's just a very simple approach. And then I'll also use a mid-tier client as well. So we'll go ahead and claim a few licenses. We'll go look at the various ways to view what that license usage was, and then also look at the user log. So it's we'll kind of walk through everything here. So what I have is a couple of test drivers that are set up to do a query that will cause a floating license to be claimed. So I'll go ahead and issue this first query, get my data back, and in the background I've claimed a floating license. On my second test driver, I've actually got this set up to go to a different server than the first one. So I will log in another user and have them go to a second server. All right, so that's right now I've got 2 licenses available on the system. I should have claimed both of them with those 2 queries. And then we'll go ahead and log in a third user using the mid-tier, and I'll do a search on my simple form. And in this case, we got a message up at the top there in the top panel where it says there's no free floating write licenses available, which is the expected thing because I only had 2 on the system and I've already used 2. So when you get this warning, it means you're just now in read mode even though you are a floating license user. And so then in this case, if you went ahead and tried to modify this record here, and if this particular user didn't create this record, so they don't really have the rights to update it, you're going to get a message like this that says you do not have a write license. So, and this is the case of a floating license user not getting assigned a write license because they're all in use. Okay, so now let's look and see what our view into the licensing world shows. So what I'm going to do is log back in as an administrator. Okay. And we'll go to the license administrator console first. So we'll get our view with the old traditional admin console. And we go to application, the users, and license review view. So even though I'd said that I logged in 2 users, remember I said that I had logged in 1 on each server. So this is an example of how this admin console is a server-centric view. So the server I'm connected to only has 1 of those users. This non-admin 2 user is using a floating license on this server. The other user is on a different server. Okay, so so if we go back to to the remedy management console, which is how we get to the server group console, we go to the manage user licenses there. And in this view of the world, we now have both users that I logged in because it's across the server group view. So this will list all the users and the servers that they are connected to. Okay, so we've seen those two. Now let's go to see what the current license usage looks like. So we'll bring that form up and do a search on that. And in here we see we have the three sets of records. So as I had mentioned before, these are in sets where there's a main and a sub-record. So this is either going to be a main record, or in the second one will be a sub-record for the particular server that the user is on. So there's going to be, while that user is holding this license, there's going to be this set of records in this form. In the sub-records, there will be one for every server they're connected to. So then as they log off, those sub-records will disappear. And then when all the sub-records disappear, meaning that this user is logged off everywhere, the information about this license usage period gets transferred to the historical form. So if we go back to the, take a look at the historical license usage, we'll do a search on that form. And we see that we have, the demo user has had historically used a license for a period, and then this non-admin 2 and non-admin 3 users have what is known as that open-ended record. So when they began to use a license, this open-ended record got put in here, and then it's going to get closed out when they log off. So right now, this information is the valuable information that's in here now is what time they acquired the license. So as when I mentioned that example before during the presentation, we talked about how having this information in here allows you to use this one form by itself to find out how many users are on the system at a given point in time. Okay, so let's take a look at the user log to see what we got in there during that those few transactions I made. So we'll scroll on down to this admin activity, and so in this case we have, for example, when I first logged that first user onto the system, right here, it recorded that, okay, I'm using the first of the 2 available licenses. And then the second user, remember, went to a different system, so they're not going to be represented in here. But what we will see is that, okay, there's one license in use here, and then when the second user trying to log into here, they couldn't because across the server group, all 2 are used, and I had told you before that the server will always do a query if it's about to say that a license can't be granted. And then the evidence of that is in here, where a server did a query and found out that 2 were in use. And so it's got the very latest updated count on how many are in use and can make the informed decision to not grant a license. So that's what we see in here. In each one of the subsequent calls that the server made when I was trying to modify that record, all getting this indication that there's no right license available. Okay, so that's how the user log gives you this, transaction blow-by-blow view of what has occurred. Okay, let's see what happens when somebody logs out. So we'll go ahead and exit out of this particular session, so I'll terminate that session, and now we can go back to our view of the world. Like the current license usage form, and I'll refresh that, and now we see that we still have that demo user, which is me now doing this license usage viewing. And the non-admin 2 user that was there previously is now gone. So that user has been, quote-unquote, transferred into the historical license usage form because their license usage period ended. And if we go to the historical license usage form and we refresh that, we now should see that the not admin 2 user, and we do, has a time release. So the record, that open-ended record that was put in here previously when they were currently using a license, has now been closed off by adding the release time in here and calculating how many seconds that they were using that license. Yet the not admin 3 user still has the open-ended record because that user has not been logged off. Okay, so that is, you know, a really composite demo of, you know, how licenses, when they're granted and released, how we can go look at how those transactions are recorded in the system, and how you can go view what usage is in there. Okay, so let's returning to the presentation. There's various references in the BMC docs that are very good and valuable to look at. One is a licensing overview. In this, you know, is a good summary of what licensing is about in AR system. There's also a working with BMC Remedy AR system licenses. It's a topic that is very informative. There's a detailed about the license types for users that access the AR system, and then a sort of a client-centric view of releasing floating licenses. And even though this title says to a license pool, it's not referring to that server concept of license pooling. It really just means the pool of available licenses. So it's not information on the license pooling feature. It's about releasing floating licenses in various clients and how it's done. So that's good information as well. Okay, let's summarize what we've talked about today. We have seen that licenses are required for the legal use of AR system, and then we talked about the 3 levels: the server, the application, and the user licenses. We've seen what choices of license types are available, giving flexibility to how users are given access to the system. We've talked about the variety of methods that one can view the license usage in the system. We've seen the relatively new server group console, which gives you a server group view of what licenses are being used. And then we've shown, you know, some of the details about how the licenses are shared and managed across the server group. Okay, so I'm going to turn this back over to Greg and continue on with the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And at this time, Jenny, would you please provide instructions to our callers to signal us for questions?
Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question, please signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. If you're using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. A voice prompt on the phone line will indicate when your line is open. At that time, please state your name before posing your question. Again, press *1 to ask a question, and we'll pause for just a moment to allow everyone an opportunity to signal for questions.
Bob, while we wait for questions, a question came in via the Q&A. In the mid-tier configuration, there is a license release timeout. What is that for?
So that, yeah, the title of that is very generic, this license release timeout. But what it's really referring to is that functionality when a user closes down their browser without logging off. So it's a timeout that says how much time should the mid-tier wait before it issues the release to the server for that user. So that it's, I think the smallest window there is 30 seconds. So it's just saying, what's the time you want me to wait before I release this user when the browser has been closed. It's not a generic license release timeout that affects the server's license release timeout. It's mid-tier specific.
Okay, thank you. And
we do have a
Jenny, do we have any questions?
Yes, we have a question queued up. We'll go to that first caller.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, just a quick question on one of the earlier statements. It said that licenses are assigned on a query under the assumption that the intent is to update after the query. If someone were to add a button to generate a URL to get, like, say, like a shortcut to a work order, okay, is that the intent, how does the system know that the intent is to update after the query? Like searching a change, an incident, a work order, does it automatically assign an application license?
Yeah, the belief is that it's an assumption that the user is intent to update. So it doesn't have any indication based on that action, but it's an assumption that the system makes that there is going to be a subsequent update. And again, that's to protect that user to make sure that they do have a right license when they begin to type in their update.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And as a reminder, it is *1 if you do have a question at this time.
And Bob, I have another one from the Q&A. If I accidentally delete my license report.txt file, what should I do?
Okay, so this is an issue with that file really wasn't protected, so it wasn't in a very good location. So there has been various reports of that happening where somebody accidentally deletes it, and there was an addition made in version 1805 where the file is backed up every time it's updated by the server. But prior to 1805, the best practice was to just find the latest backup that you have and get that file back onto the system. Hopefully, not much data is lost. But after 1805, the system will automatically restore the file from the backup that it has maintained in the database. So if it's accidentally deleted, it will reappear again automatically after the version 8, if you're running 1805 or above.
And at this time, there are no other questions in the queue.
Okay. I have another one that is in there. Is there a way to get a list of unique users that held a license on a specific server during some period of time?
Okay, so let's see. So I think the only way to do that would be via one of those third-party log scraper tools. So the user log has all the information about who is logged in on a specific server. So to get a server-specific view, you'd have to use some type of log scraper utility. The license tracking, once each in a current license usage form, you've got information about what server a user's logged into, just because there's that main record and sub-record arrangement, and there's a sub-record for every user the user's logged into. So you're going to have that information on current usage, but once that license usage gets transferred to the historical form, the server name stuff is not carried forward, so there's no fields in the historical usage form that have a server name or list of server names where the user was logged into. So that data is not transferred. So it would take some kind of enhancement to those forms to carry forward server name information in order to satisfy that need to get that list of users per server. So currently it's not available in the historical license usage form. So that gets you back to the log scraping utility that I talked about. So I think that's the only way.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on the line, Jenny?
And as a final reminder, it is *1 if you would like to ask a question at this time. We'll pause just a moment.
Bob, I'm going to give you another question from the Q&A. If a user has read license and performs a query, does that also allocate a write license?
No. So if a user has a read license and does a query, they are a read license user, and so no write license is going to be used. They're not eligible to get a floating write license if they've been assigned a read license. So no, it won't use a write license.
Okay. And just a quick check, Jenny, any questions queued?
There are no other questions in the queue, sir.
Okay. Bob, I'll continue with the next one. if mid-tier logout timer doesn't control the server timeout, where do we set the timeout for the server?
So that's the server timeout is set in the admin console. There's I can't remember exactly what tab it's on. Maybe the licensing tab. It'll have a edit box in there that allows you to set how many hours the timeout value is, and the minimum value is 1 hour. So it's in the admin console, the configuration, and also in centralized configuration as well.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, any questions queued up at this time?
And there are no questions in the queue at this time, but it is *1 if anyone has a question.
Okay, we'll pause for a second. Bob, I have another question. Will it sometimes, it seems like, is it possible to submit data in Smart IT with just a read license, like via mid-tier?
Yeah, the same would apply to Smart IT as mid-tier, where, depending on the application functionality, their users can submit records with read licenses. So, I don't know all the details of how complex Smart IT might be getting, but generally that should be true with the client, that just like the mid-tier behavior, where a read license does allow you to submit a record within the permissions that are allowed. So if a user has permissions to that form.
Okay. And checking again, Jenny, any other questions queued up for?
Yes, we have a question in the queue. We'll go to that caller. Please go ahead.
Hi, I've got another question about the license report.txt file. When we're currently upgrading our servers, so we have the license text or license report.txt on our old servers, and we'll soon be generating them on our new servers. We're going to retire the old servers. So how can we generate an accurate license report, for our annual review with BMC?
Okay, yeah, I understand the question. So what I don't know is what the BMC policy is for that, because it's more of a, the licensing group that handles that. What I would suspect is that you would have to generate reports for both systems and send in both of them. That seems logical to me, but I don't know actually what the policy is. I don't believe there's any way to transfer over information and then get a combined listing. So it would seem to me that the only way to handle it would be to have just two separate reports. Here's the time period 1 report, and then here's the time period 2 report. When you combine them, you end up with 1 year. But I think I'll have to check with your account rep to find out exactly what the BMC policy is for system transfers like that. Yeah, sorry, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
There are no other questions in the queue.
Okay. Bob, I'm asking one more from the Q&A about, can you explain how the license bundle works?
Well, my understanding of the license bundle is that it is it's again a package of user licenses that allows somebody to perform a certain role. So it's a way of selling the licenses so that they come in a bundle, so that when you're trying to purchase 10 bundled licenses for the Remedy help desk or service desk user, that bundle is going to contain whatever application licenses are necessary to perform that role, plus the AR platform right license. And so when you buy 10 of those, you're buying 10 sets of those, and then that gets put into the system as those 10 bundled licenses. Prior to license bundling, if being supported by the server, a customer would have to buy that bought a bundle license would have to break it down into its component licenses and then add those components to the system. So there was some spreadsheet work that needed to be done there to trying to determine, well, how many AR user licenses did I actually buy when I bought these 3 different bundles? And then you had to do the math and then add the number of AR system licenses into the system. With the bundled arrangement, you just have to enter the bundles into the system, and then under the covers, the server figures out what licenses are included in that bundle and does the breakdown by itself. So, so no one has to go to a spreadsheet anymore and figure out, how many of the various license types did I actually purchase, and add them all up and then enter those in the system. So that's the, how bundling was designed to work, the bundled license feature that was added to the server.
Great, thank you, Bob. Any other questions on the line, Jenny, at this time?
There are no other questions in queue.
Okay. We'll take a few seconds for another round of questions. If there's anything, please ask via the Q&A or signal for the operator to ask verbally.
And as a final reminder, that is *1 for questions on the phone. And there are no questions in the queue at this time, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And at this time, we'll move into our wrap-up of this webinar. Wanted to thank everyone for joining today and talking about some self-help and contacting BMC. This webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as in communities. The schedule for this webinar series is on communities at this link. And also our knowledge base supports self-search, and it's blended across videos, documentation. So one search can search all these different sources to provide a rich set of answers 24/7. Contacting technical support via web, phone, and email, as well as our social mechanisms are available. And again, wanted to thank everybody for joining this month's webinar. This live recording and the Q&A will be posted within a week of today's live presentation to our YouTube channel as well as communities. Wanted to thank you for joining. And that concludes this month's webinar.